Hello, class. I'd like to uh, begin the lecture slides that I told you that I would be uploading onto YouTube for you. This first set of slides, what we're going to do, we're going to skip through the first few slides because they include questions that I'm going to ask each of you to do at a later time for one of the online forum discussions. And so what I'd like to do is to skip down to kind of the meat of this section. And here we're going to be talking about introductory issues, kind of a general overview of counseling. And then we're going to be talking about counseling competencies. The competencies for counseling, these refer to the most important attributes that a good or an effective counselor can have. And this has been a really helpful and really important lecture for me to give through the years because it's always a good reminder to myself what we're all about and what it is that we do. What you'll also notice in this is I think that whether or not you become a therapist, I think there are some lessons to be learned in this lecture that are good for you for the rest of your life, whether you become a counselor or not. So, because they involve some degree of morals and ethics and just how to think about others and yourself. So notice we're going to be skipping through some of these questions here, and a few of them have answers. And now we're going to come down to the essential qualities of a competent therapist. The first one I mention here, and these are in no particular order, but I will emphasize the ones that I think are most important. The first one we'll talk about is balance. An effective therapist or an effective counselor is able to lead a very balanced life. Notice, for example, that balance, sometimes when we think of the word balance, we think of someone who is, I don't know if you've ever seen those, like those advertisements or those brochures where they're trying to advertise a spa or a resort or some sort of fancy hotel where they'll usually have a long dock that goes out into the water, and sitting on the edge of the water, there'll usually be some person with their hands out to their side, kind of in this Zen-like pose, as if to say that this is what it means to be balanced. This is what it means to have everything in order. And in actuality, I find that metaphor to be very unhelpful. If you are absolutely balanced, you're actually quite immobile and not able to move. Because if you're, I mean, when you think about it, a tightrope walker going across a huge chasm on a thin cord is technically very balanced, but they're not very nimble or able to respond to their environment. So when we say the word balance, I mean, that's helpful, but I think it's more important that I actually like to use the word seasonal. When we are seasonal in our lives, that means that we know when to turn things on, when to turn things off. We know when to step on the gas. We know when to step on the brakes. There are going to be periods in our lives where we're going to have to make personal sacrifices. Then there are going to be other times in our lives when we're going to have to be more indulgent, festive, and celebratory. So a good therapist, a good counselor, knows how to stabilize the ebbs and flows of life. They know how to go with the flow, and they also know how to control their environments pretty well. They can tolerate the good times. They can tolerate the bad times. They can also, when they function as a therapist, they're really good at not getting too high on themselves or too proud of themselves, but they're also pretty good at being able to protect themselves and not get too down when a client, for example, may not progress as quickly as they want them to. So it's just a good overall attribute to have as a counselor is good balance. Second, and this is one of the three most important ones, is professionalism. A good counselor or a good therapist is someone who knows about the laws, the techniques, they know the literature very well, they study things very well, they understand what the ethics are, they understand what their responsibilities are, they act reasonably and professionally. And now, that may be kind of an intimidating thing to talk about because who in their right mind knows every single thing that you're supposed to do absolutely in every situation? Well, nobody knows those things. But a professional is someone who knows the rules, knows the laws, and acts reasonably in difficult situations. And so we'll come back to the issue of professionalism again and again when we talk about what it means to be a really good therapist. The three attributes I'm about to mention here next, genuineness, warmth, and authenticity, These are three attributes that are very, very important from the perspective of the client. So when clients are asked, what are some attributes that you find most important in a therapist? These are the attributes that jumped out at the very top of the list. When a therapist is genuine, when a therapist is warm, and when a therapist is authentic. So it's not enough that you're just a good listener. It's not enough that you can just robotically say words back to a person that they've said to you. People want to know that you care. People want to know that you're not just collecting a paycheck, that you really do have a human kindness to you, that you're warm, that you're caring, that you respect them as a person, and empathize with them. And that's the last point on this slide, is empathy. Empathy is probably the most important attribute to have as a therapist. That's when you understand the seriousness and the meaningfulness of a client or a patient's suffering. When you can put yourself in the shoes of another person. You guys have, I'm sure, heard of the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is when you hear about someone else going through a difficult time and you feel sad for them. Empathy is much more powerful. Empathy is when you put yourself in their shoes and try to imagine what it must be like to go through what they're going through. It's a deeper level of care and concern than mere sympathy. And when you can think empathically about another person, this is what makes for a really good therapist. There in the middle is optimistic and realistic. I think a really good therapist knows how to balance that, those two realities between being realistic, right? This is not going to be a perfect scenario. Life doesn't always turn out the way that we want it to. So you have to be realistic, but you should also be optimistic in this sense, and that is that when you've gone through a good counseling relationship, when you've gone through therapy, people stand a very good chance of reasonably improving. So you have a lot to be hopeful about. You have a lot to be optimistic about. You don't want to make promises that you can't keep, but you can also hold out hope that things can get better. So convince the patients that there is hope for their improvement, but just warn them about how difficult the therapeutic process can be. That is a deep truth. Therapy is very difficult. Therapy is a heck of a lot of hard work. Being in a marriage is a heck of a lot of hard work. If we're going to be in a relationship with somebody else and we care about that relationship, it's going to take work. But remember, therapy is good work and it's worth the effort. As my grandfather was fond of saying, anything that's worth doing is worth doing well. It's its own reward. In parentheses there, I put the only thing that you're guaranteeing. This reminds me of a question that my teacher in graduate school asked me. He actually asked it of our entire class. He said, as a therapist, you are only guaranteeing one thing for your clients. And he had us guess what that might be. And we went around the room and we all said what we thought it was. And we were all wrong until we got to a young woman named Melissa. And Melissa said, the only thing that we are guaranteeing is 50 minutes of our time. And the professor said, you are exactly right. When it comes right down to it, the only thing that you are promising is that you will spend 50 minutes with your client. Of course, you're going to try to do more than just pass the time, but that's the only thing you can guarantee. You can't guarantee that you're going to be a good therapist. You can't guarantee that you're going to be the most caring person in the world. And you can't guarantee that a person's going to feel better. You can be hopeful that a person will feel better, but you can't guarantee it. The only thing you can guarantee is how much time you can spend with a client. By the way, for the sake of this class, I will use the term client and patient interchangeably. So I hope there's not a lot of confusion. So when I do these abbreviations on my slides, sometimes you'll see PT for patient, sometimes you'll see the word CT for client. I use them interchangeably. Also, I use the word counseling and therapy and psychotherapy basically interchangeably here. There are some subtle differences between those terms, but as far as we're concerned, when we're talking about the subject of counseling, we're talking about being a professional, not doing informal counseling or coaching. We're talking about entering into the role of being a professional healer, someone who is hired by someone else, and that person must be sanctioned or licensed by the state, or supervised appropriately by someone who is licensed by the state to be a healer, an authorized healer. Next slide. Other essential qualities would include thinking multiculturally, which really is just a commitment to trying to understand the world that the other person occupies. Really, to think multiculturally and to have multicultural competency is just something that exists under the larger umbrella of empathy. So it's very important for us to see our patients in context, not just see them as we see them, but see them as how they see themselves or how others in their communities might see them. This is very important, and we'll get back to this soon. Next is a sense of humor. This is really helpful. You can't always take everything so seriously. Even though there will be many people coming in with problems that are deadly serious. There is grief, there is loss, there is trauma, there is depression. There's a lot to be serious about, and there's a lot to take seriously. Nevertheless, there are genuine moments of happiness and joy and humor that exist in therapy. So it's very important that you don't take yourself too seriously, and that you model that for clients not to take themselves too seriously. Take your job seriously, sure. Take your responsibilities seriously, sure. Take your commitments seriously, sure. But don't necessarily take yourself too seriously. That's going to go a long way in helping you convey to your client that they are human too. If everything is always so serious all the time, people will forget how to be a human being. It's important to be able to laugh at yourself, to laugh at some of life's foibles, to laugh at some of our imperfections, to throw our hands in the air and say, you know what, that's just something that I can't control, and I'm going to leave that between God and God. And that's about it. It helps to say that every once in a while. Another quality is that it really helps to be genuinely curious about who you are as a person and genuinely curious about who another person is as well. I think if you wanted to be a counselor or a therapist, but you didn't like people very much, this would be a very, very dull job. But if you enjoy people, if you're genuinely fascinated by people, if you are motivated to want to help them, moreover, if you feel a sense of honor, and if you feel, in a way, humbled by the prospect of being able to enter into the private world of a client, this is a very beautiful and wonderful thing. So I think people who retain a natural curiosity about the world make the very best therapists. Here's another one that's extremely important. A therapist needs to have good boundaries. Now, you've heard this term before, I'm sure, boundaries. This was a term that was not talked about a lot in years past. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a couple of Christian authors named Cloud and Townsend wrote a book called Boundaries, and it was subtitled When to Say Yes and When to Say No to Take Control of Your Life. And this was the first real widespread book or work on the subject of how to keep boundaries that was part of the popular literature. And since this book was published, it has been a bestseller, and it has caused many therapists to talk more and more and more about the importance of how to keep healthy boundaries. Boundaries just basically refer to the knowledge and the awareness that you are you and that another person is another person. And so not interfering into another person's personal space. That's both emotional space and physical space. So knowing where you end and another person begins. Boundaries refer to not taking on too much in your life, knowing your limits. For example, it's really important not to take your work home. That if a person with good boundaries, a therapist with good boundaries, knows how to keep their work at work and knows how to enter into other relationships and only focus on those relationships. It's kind of like one of the big complaints we have during the era of cell phones. The problem with a cell phone is that when you're on your cell phone, you're not fully present. It's almost impossible to be fully present when you're on a cell phone. And so cell phones are kind of a good example of how we violate boundaries all the time, all over the place, and we really shouldn't. If, for example, we're having a conversation with somebody, that conversation has boundaries around it. And there's a sense in which we're talking to someone and that it would be very rude to interrupt. But if we get our cell phone out in the middle of the conversation and start chatting with somebody else, it's kind of a boundary violation. We've taken one context and introduced a different context altogether into that situation. So boundaries can also refer to giving more of yourself than you feel comfortable giving. Have you ever had someone in your life who asked more of you than you wanted them to ask, or that you felt comfortable giving? Have you, in turn, ever asked somebody else to give more than they were comfortable giving? That's a boundary violation. A boundary violation occurs whenever our needs interfere with another person's space or comfort levels. This comes up in therapy as well. Sometimes it's possible for counselors or therapists to be too generous with their time or too generous in their approach. Maybe if they had a counseling session that was scheduled for 45 minutes, and then they give an hour and 45 minutes to a person for free. That might be okay to do once or twice just out of your own sense of generosity. But when you are chronically this way or excessively this way, it could be that you have some needs that you need to get worked out. Perhaps, for example, it could be that you are seeking approval and you're more interested in the approval of your clients than you are in providing quality care. Here's a really good saying: intimacy is by invitation only. You can never force someone else into an intimate relationship. You can't guilt someone into an intimate relationship, or else it's going to feel unsafe. No one has the right to tell you that they're going to be intimate with you. That's a boundary violation. So a good therapist knows how to maintain and keep healthy boundaries. A couple of other notes about counseling and psychotherapy. Your clients will often get worse before they get better. I'm going to say that again. Your clients will often get worse before they get better. One of the reasons for this is that when they're living their lives, a lot of their defenses are still operating. A lot of their defenses have still been kept alive. And when you upset that, when you get the person into therapy and their defenses start breaking down a little bit, they often say to themselves, I'm doing way worse than I ever thought I was doing. And you're beginning to chip away and eat away a little bit at their defenses. That can make a person, for the time being, feel a little bit worse than they even did before they came into counseling. A patient must accept themselves fully and truthfully before healing. You can't lie to yourself anymore. If a person's going to heal, they have to confront the ugly truth. And there often is a lot of ugly truth inside of a person's life. Another note, sometimes you will be dealing with people who are going through incredible grief, maybe even some degree of trauma. If that is the case, one of the best things you could ever do is to encourage people to tell their story repeatedly to you until it doesn't hurt anymore. That doesn't have to be the only thing you do in a particular counseling session. Maybe you only want to spend about 15 or 20 minutes of the session talking about that. But it's very, very healthy for people who are grieving or really suffering just to tell their story, their painful story of loss. It helps them move on a little bit more effectively and a little bit more quickly than when you don't have them talk about it. Here's another good little pearl of wisdom. Sometimes when you're counseling someone, you'll find that people are more interested in the deal that they're getting from you, that is, the price they're going to be paying, rather than in the quality of the care they're going to be receiving. If that is the case, please proceed with caution. Don't turn them down necessarily, but you can always tell a lot about a person when they're way more interested in how much they're paying you or not paying you than in the quality of care they're getting. Yes, therapy can be expensive. Yes, not all insurance plans pay for therapy. But we also have to remember, therapy on average takes around, I'm not even going to say that this is the average, but let's just say that it takes about 20 to 30 sessions to get a person to feeling better. Now that's not something that's etched in stone. That's not a guarantee. But let's just say that that's about what it takes on average to get a person who's not doing well at all to start to feel a little bit better. And let's say that they had to pay $150 per session over 30 sessions. Well, you start doing the math in your head, that's a lot of money. That's $4,500. $4,500 that's an amount that people very often don't have. But then if you start thinking about it, I mean, $4,500 for some people is the difference between getting like a few optional extras on a car. If you're going to buy the LX model at $19,000 or the EX model at $23,000, I mean, what you've basically done is you've said that you're not willing to pay to go to therapy to feel better and maybe change your life, but you would be willing to pay a little bit extra to have a moonroof and nice tires or nice rims on your car. I mean, it's weird the way our perceptions about money come up when we talk about counseling and psychotherapy. But as a rule, it's much better to have someone who's interested in the quality of care they're going to be receiving than in how much they're going to be paying. So yes, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be sensitive to when a person doesn't have money. Of course, you should try to work with people as much as possible. But there are just some people who are out there to try to save as much money as they can, and they won't be happy until they feel like you've given up something. Stay away from these people, or at least proceed with extreme caution. And don't ever be embarrassed of how much you charge for counseling. Those of you that go on to become counselors, when you actually do become a counselor someday and start charging the amount that you do, you might feel guilty about charging what you're charging. Don't feel guilty about charging what you're charging. You are worth it. Other notes, skipping down now to slide number 16. It's very important to consult. When you are a therapist, obviously you have to keep what you say private, but if you're having a difficult situation, you can talk with another therapist about a case without using identifying information that is designed to help maybe a more seasoned or experienced therapist offer some wisdom to you or some counsel to you as you're working yourself through a tough case. This is very, very common, and the best therapists consult. The worst therapists never consult. Another note, another little pearl of wisdom for you when it comes to talking about counseling, and that is everything is grist for the mill. What this saying means is that if you're thinking about an old mill, you're trying to put only the pure ingredients into the mill so that it will come out with what the product that you're trying to make. But sometimes unhelpful material gets into the mill. That's called grist. And a little bit of that is okay. In other words, the saying means that even though not everything goes smoothly in counseling, even the stuff that doesn't work out very well can be very useful and very helpful and very teachable for you going forward. If you find yourself, for example, getting mad at a client, or if you find yourself blurting something out that you wish that you hadn't, or if you are unintentionally late and that causes offense to your client, all of this is something that can be used to learn how to treat the patient a little bit better. So use everything, use the good and the bad to help you with treatment. If a patient becomes angry at you, this is meaningful information. If you become angry with a patient, this is meaningful information. If a client shows up late 4 times in a row, this is meaningful information. If you show up to a therapy session 4 times in a row, this is meaningful information. What I'm trying to say is that there's no waste. Everything can mean something and everything can be meaningful for you going forward. So try to remember that. Next, always charge for your services even when you are working with poor clients. I ask the question, why? Because that is a fair question, right? Doesn't that seem kind of cruel? Why would you charge your clients for something if they can't afford it? Well, what you'll often find is that sometimes people are not very truthful when it comes to how much money they have. Sometimes people will say they have absolutely no money. Then you come to find out that they've actually been spending a lot of money on all sorts of other things. What they are is not poor, they're just cash poor because they spend a lot of money. But even more importantly than that, that's not the main reason why I'm saying this. Even more importantly, you always want people to feel like they have some degree of investment in what it is that they're doing in therapy. So say like you charge $100 an hour and you're working with a client who is very, very poor. You can come up with $3 per session as an agreed upon rate. So $3 may not sound like very much, but if you're very, very poor, $3 could be the difference between getting a fast food hamburger today or not getting anything to eat today. If you have a rate of $3 and a client knows how much that is, and that's what you're charging, even though you're not going to make very much money off of this client, they will feel more invested and they will take the therapeutic process more seriously. It's a very weird paradox, but the more you charge for therapy, the better the quality of service people seem to think that they're getting. That's not always the case, but that's very frequently the case. I'll say it again, it's a very weird thing. The more you charge for your services, the more you charge for therapy, the better quality of care people often believe that they're getting. An example of this is the car, the Volvo. Some of you guys know what a Volvo is. A Volvo used to be a very, very inexpensive car. It was a very economical car, and the sales for Volvo in the 1970s were very sluggish. But someone in their advertising department decided that they should immediately increase the price of the Volvo dramatically, on the reasoning that people will assume that a Volvo is a luxury car. And that's exactly what they did. They raised the price of the Volvo, and lo and behold, people began to buy Volvos at the higher price. They sold many more of them. And what's interesting is that people that bought Volvos thought they were getting a more luxurious car. Now, as it turns out, Volvo is a fantastic car. I wouldn't necessarily put it in the category of a luxury car, certainly not in the 1970s or 1980s. It eventually became a luxury car brand. But for a long time, Volvo was just a very, very high quality car that was available at an economical price. And nobody felt like it was all that great to have. So it's just another weird thing in the way that people often perceive payment and quality of care. Okay, skipping down now to slide number 17, we're going to talk about listening skills here. These are really important. When you're a therapist, you need to learn how to develop these two ears of listening, or maybe what we would call the third ear. Obviously, when you're listening to someone, you're listening to what it is that they say. Like if you ask a person, how was your day today? They might say, oh, my day was okay. I went to work around 8 o'clock. I got most of what I needed to get done by about 11 o'clock. So I took an early lunch. I had a meeting back at the office when I came back from lunch scheduled for 1:30. I came back only to find out that the meeting was the meeting was canceled. So then I caught up on a few emails, and basically I was all done with work by 3 o'clock, and so I went home a couple of hours early. Okay, if you're listening to that person tell the story, and you're listening to the content of what they're saying, that means that you're paying attention to the technical aspects of what they're saying, the facts. You could repeat it back to them. You could say literally what happened to them that day. But a good therapist is not just able to listen to those things. A good therapist is able to listen with a second ear, or maybe a third ear, because we already have two ears. But they're also not, good therapists don't just pay attention to content, good therapists pay attention to process. So as you're listening to someone, you're listening for themes, tone, trends, nonverbal cues, deeper messages and meanings. You're saying things like, first maybe to yourself and then maybe later out loud. I notice that every single time you bring up this person, you're always looking at the ground. Or I notice that whenever you talk about work, you suddenly straighten up in your chair and you look very confident. Or I notice that every single time you talk about your son, you start to get a sad look in your eyes. So these are ways in which you can pay attention to what is being said that's nonverbal. Those nonverbal cues, the way that a person acts, the way that a person behaves, their mannerisms. So a good therapist doesn't just pay attention to content, they're also paying attention to process. This may sound like a difficult thing to do at the beginning, but good therapists know how to get better and better at this over time. Next are reflective listening skills. This is the most basic therapeutic skill. Now, I say that it's the most basic because it's probably the most easy skill to learn, and yet it's probably the most forgotten skill. It's so important for people to be able to be really good at reflective listening. This is very important in couples counseling when you're trying to help couples get along a little bit better in communication patterns have really been shot. It's very important that you learn how to work with a couple on how to get them better able to reflectively listen to each other. So I like to tell my clients, this is one of the easiest lessons you'll ever learn. You're going to probably think to yourself, wow, I could have done that. I didn't need a therapist to tell me how to do reflective listening. Yet at the same time, it is so quickly and easily and routinely forgotten that it bears repeating. It's one of those things. It's like if you've ever read a good book, but you always forget what's in it, and so you always have to go back to reread the book to make sure that you remember what's in it. Reflective listening skills are kind of like that. It's so easy, and yet it's so quickly forgotten. So always come back to this. If you're a therapist and you're wondering what you can do with your clients, you can always come back to reflective listening skills as a way to get better. Well, what are reflective listening skills? Reflective listening skills, that just means that you are trying to listen to another person to the point at which they are completely satisfied with your understanding of their problem. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being really listened to well, but doesn't it feel good? Doesn't it feel great when someone really listens to you and you're able to get everything out that you wanted to say, and they didn't seem to care one bit about how you came across? They just accepted what it is that you had to say. It's one of the best feelings. Well, that's what you're trying to give to somebody else. So it's important to do reflective listening because a lot of patients will not come back to see you again if they feel like that you're not listening to them and understanding their problem. It's also important to do reflective listening because when you're actually doing reflective listening, someone's saying something and then you're basically repeating back the gist of what it is that they just now said. And when you do that, it gives patients the chance to correct where they were inaccurate or where they may have been exaggerating. People often exaggerate when they're trying to talk about their problems. I once had a patient come into my office and I asked, this was our first session, and he walked into the office and I said, well, how can I help you? And he said, well, I'm just a total miserable failure. And he started listing off all the reasons why he was a miserable failure. And then, so to show that I was listening to him, I just repeated back every single thing that he said to me. And as I was repeating what he said back to him, his eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger, almost like he was stunned by what it was I was saying. But I was just saying what he had said. But nevertheless, he got very, very surprised. His eyes got very big. His eyes got as big as saucers. And he said, Dr. Pope, it's not that bad. Which then I just started laughing because that's exactly what he had just told me were his reasons for being a miserable failure and a loser. So I was just using his own words, and yet somehow when we hear other people say our words, it helps us clarify, no, that's not quite what I meant. So that's one of the good benefits of reflecting listening skills is you can help people not exaggerate. It helps people feel like their problems are unique when, in fact, many of their problems are common or shared. But most importantly, it just validates clients. So what you're doing is during reflective listening is just repeating things back to the client to the point that they are very satisfied that you've heard them successfully. We will definitely come back to reflective listening later in the semester. This next slide basically gets a little bit into more detail about reflective listening skills. Reflective listening skills are also going to be pretty good for being able to convey empathy. What's interesting is that you don't actually need to show a lot of empathy when you're doing reflective listening skills. So in a way, it's cheating because all you're doing is repeating what the person's saying, but just repeating it back, just the very act of listening feels empathetic from the point of view of the client. So that's why it's very important to do. It also helps us to summarize our goals for therapy and what our basic problems are. So here's an example. Someone might say, the therapist might say, so you feel like there's nobody in this world who really knows you, and you would like help in counseling to open up to others. The person might say, yeah, that sounds about right. So if you skip down here, you can see that there actually is a reflective listening exercise that we can try out. And you can try this out with a friend of yours, or you can try this out with a classmate. But basically what it is, it's just a back and forth. So someone starts out with the opening invitation. What brings you here today, or what would you like to talk about? And then the patient speaks. So you can do like a role play with this. The patient might say, I'm afraid that every time I leave my house that something terrible will happen. And then the therapist just merely repeats, you're afraid that every time you leave your house that something terrible will happen. Then the patient clarifies, well, not every time. Maybe there are times in which I feel pretty good and I'm able to go out and run some errands, or if there's a birthday party or a celebration to go to, maybe I can muster up enough courage to go. But a lot of the time, I just feel very scared that something bad is about to happen. So then then you would just go back and repeat that again. So the therapist then re-invites, is there anything else I may need to know about this problem to help me understand it better? And then the client will expand on their problems. That point number 5 there on slide number 21 is one of the most important questions you could ever ask as a therapist. Don't ever assume that a person is done talking about an issue just because they've stopped talking. Open up the door for them to talk about more. Say more. Is there anything else I may need to know about this problem to help me understand it better? Maybe even you could pretend a little bit. Even if you feel like you do understand, pretend like you don't understand and say, can you just help me understand this a little bit better? Or could you put some legs underneath this for me and help me understand the detail about this? Or help me understand the context or the situation that you're in. Almost everybody is able to do this and to expand upon it. But what's the problem? In our actual lives, when we're having an argument with somebody, almost nobody asks the other person to say more. We're usually waiting for the other person to stop talking just so we can jump in and defend ourselves and say our piece. So notice number 5, what you are doing as a therapist when you ask this question, is there anything else I may need to know about you? You have just taken a great big step up in this person's book of good, helpful people that they know. I would bet you in the lives of most clients that you see, they may have 1 or 2 at most people who would ever ask question number 5, is there anything else I may need to know about this problem to help me understand it better? And so in that case, the client would expand upon their problem, and then the therapist will then summarize and basically go into detail about what it is that the client needs and where the client wants help. And you just repeat this process as necessary. It's a really helpful exercise.